The laughter wasn't loud. It was worse. It was the quiet, condescending kind, a rustle of amusement that slid through the ranks of the assembled SEALs like sand through a sieve. They stood in the oppressive Coronado sun, their own gear a uniform landscape of state-of-the-art polymer and matte black finishes. And then there was her. Sergeant Anna Reisner stood at ease, her posture a rigid line of discipline that seemed foreign, almost archaic, next to their fluid readiness. It wasn't just her Army combat uniform, a stark digital gray against their naval patterns, that set her apart. It was the helmet she held loosely in her left hand. It was an old Michigan 2000, a design 2 generations out of date. The shell was scarred with a history of scrapes and impacts. The original tan, paint peeking through a hastily applied coat of flat dark earth. A clunky, oversized strobe mount was bolted to the back, and the suspension system was a relic of worn nylon straps, not the modern dial-fit harnesses they all used. To the operators of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, men whose lives depended on the bleeding edge of technology, it was a museum piece. A joke. "Looks like she pulled that thing out of surplus store," Specialist Davies muttered to the man next to him, just loud enough for the sound to carry on the dry breeze. Reisner's eyes, a flat, unreadable shade of gray, didn't flicker. She registered the comment, filed it away with the same dispassionate efficiency she used for everything else. The angle of the sun, the position of the armed guards on the perimeter, the faint scent of salt and diesel in the air. The mockery was just another variable in a new and unwelcome equation. They saw an outdated helmet. She felt the familiar weight of it, a counterbalance to a history they couldn't possibly comprehend. They laughed at the symbol of her survival, but they hadn't seen it closely yet. Soon they would, and when they did, the laughter would stop. The symbol was almost gone, a ghost of white paint worn down by grit and time, nestled just above the brim. A stylized wolf's head, skeletal and gaunt, its hollow eyes staring forward. It was a whisper from another world, a world far removed from the polished order of this naval base. Here, it was just another scratch on a piece of junk. But in that other world, it meant something. It meant the quiet death that came in the dead of night. It meant the hunter that never left a track. It meant you were already dead, you just hadn't realized it yet. Reisner adjusted her grip on the worn shell, the texture as familiar as her own skin. Let them laugh. The helmet didn't care, and neither did she. Colonel Marcus Thorne's office was a monument to a distinguished, if predictable, career. Polished plaques gleamed on the mahogany walls. A miniature trident stood proudly on his desk, and the air smelled of lemon wax and authority. He held Reisner's file in his hand, but his posture suggested he was holding something distasteful, like a dead fish. He gestured to the chair opposite him without looking up. "Sergeant Reisner," he began, his voice a low baritone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "Your file is unusual." He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes a piercing blue that had assessed, judged, and dismissed countless subordinates. He took in her ramrod-straight posture, her impassive face. "Army, E5. Records are heavily redacted. A string of temporary duty assignments with no clear operational through-line, and a transfer request, approved at a level I can't even see, to be assigned here. To Coronado." He let the file drop onto his desk with a soft thud. "To my base." The implication was clear. "What are you doing here?" Reisner remained silent, her hands resting on her knees. She had anticipated this. Men like Thorne operated on clear hierarchies and established pedigrees. SEALs, Marines, Rangers, these were known quantities. An Army sergeant with a file full of black ink was an anomaly, and anomalies were threats to order. "I'm here to follow orders, sir," she said, her voice even and low, betraying no emotion. Thorne leaned back, steepling his fingers. He gave a thin, humorless smile. "Of course you are. Everyone follows orders. But the question, Sergeant, is why those orders were given. We're the tip of the spear here. We don't have billets for administrative liaisons. We don't need someone to manage our paperwork." He was fishing, trying to get her to volunteer information to justify her own existence in his world. She didn't bite. I understand, sir. His smile tightened. The woman was a stone wall. He decided on a different tack, one of benevolent dismissal. He would place her where she could do the least harm, a quiet corner where she would eventually fade into the bureaucratic background noise. Your file lists advanced weapons maintenance as a tertiary skill set, he said, a note of condescension creeping into his tone. We have a surplus of armorers, but Chief Warrant Officer Mendez in the main armory can always use an extra pair of hands. You'll be assigned to him. Inventory, diagnostics, cataloging. Keep the place tidy. It was the military equivalent of being sent to the mailroom. The armory was a concrete box, a place of methodical, repetitive work far from the action, from the planning, from the very purpose of a base like this. It was a clear, unambiguous message. You are not one of us. You're not welcome. Stay out of the way. Understood, sir, Reisner said, her expression unchanged. Good, Thorne said, already picking up another file. His attention shifted. That will be all. Dismissed. Reisner stood, executed a crisp about-face, and walked out of the office. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her off from the world of command and strategy. As she walked down the polished hallway, the faint scent of lemon wax was replaced by the familiar, comforting aroma of gun oil and solvent drifting from the direction of the armory. Thorne thought he had exiled her. He had no idea he'd just given her the keys to the kingdom. The main armory at NAB Coronado was less a room and more a cavern of steel and concrete. Cages of rifles stretched to the ceiling. Crates of ammunition were stacked in precise, formidable walls. It was the heart of the base, the source of its lethal power, and to Sergeant Reisner, it was a library of unspoken truths. Chief Mendez, a man whose gut preceded him by a good 6 inches and whose cynicism was older than Reisner herself, had given her a tablet and a simple instruction. Start in Section Gamma. Scan every asset, verify the serial, mark it green. Don't get creative. For 3 days, Reisner did exactly that. She scanned M4S, HK 416S, SIG sour pistols, and FN scars. She cataloged optics, suppressors, and laser designators. The younger SEALs who came in to draw or return weapons would see her in the corner, a quiet, focused shadow, and the smirks would return. Davies and his friends would trade jokes about the army clerk playing with their toys. Reisner never acknowledged them. She was too busy reading. Because the weapons told stories. A rifle with heavy carbon buildup in the gas tube belonged to an operator who favored rapid fire. A pistol with worn grips indicated someone with large hands and a relentless dry-fire practice regimen. She found a dozen optics whose zero had drifted, a subtle but potentially fatal flaw. She didn't report it. She simply took them to a side bench, broke out a toolkit, and meticulously recalibrated each one, her movements economical and precise. She found a saw machine gun that had been tagged for persistent jamming issues. Within 20 minutes of disassembly, she identified a minuscule burr on the feed pawl, a factory defect no one else had caught. She polished it smooth with a jeweler's file, reassembled the weapon, and placed it back on the rack, its tag discreetly removed. Her observation wasn't limited to the hardware. The armory was a crossroads. She learned the rhythms of the base from the chatter. She learned which teams were on rotation, who the hot-headed new lieutenants were, and which senior chiefs commanded absolute loyalty. While verifying inventory schematics on her tablet, she cross-referenced them with the base's public-facing structural blueprints. She found discrepancies. An old ventilation shaft, marked as sealed on the official plans, was still accessible behind a row of storage lockers in her section. A new fiber optic cable conduit created a narrow, man-sized crawl space under the main command building that didn't appear on any security overlay. She wasn't snooping. She was mapping the terrain, just as she had been trained to do. Every environment, whether a foreign city or a friendly base, was a system of patterns, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. People saw a woman counting guns. She saw a battlefield. On the 4th day, Specialist Davies came in, his swagger undiminished. He tossed his rifle onto the return counter. "Give her a good cleaning, Sergeant." She got dirty. Reisner took the weapon. It was one of the rifles whose scope she had secretly re-zeroed the day before. She glanced at him, her gray eyes holding his for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. "You're pulling your shots low and to the left," she said, her voice a flat statement of fact. "It's not the rifle. It's your trigger squeeze. You're anticipating the recoil." Davies's jaw went slack. He had, in fact, been struggling on the range all morning, a fact he'd been trying to hide from his team leader. He stared at her, the condescending smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a flicker of stunned confusion. How could she possibly know that? Reisner offered no explanation. She simply turned, placed his rifle in the cradle, and began to break it down for cleaning, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The armory was suddenly very quiet. The alert came not as a siren, but as a chilling silence. At 1,400 hours on a blistering Thursday, all internal communications on the base abruptly went dead. Cell phones lost their signal. The base-wide intranet blinked into a 404 error. For a moment, there was just the hum of the air conditioners and the distant cry of gulls. Then, chaos began to ripple outward from the command and control building. Muffled pops, the distinctive sound of training munitions, echoed between the concrete structures. It was a red cell drill, unannounced, unscheduled, and utterly ruthless. A team of elite operators, handpicked from other Tier 1 units by SOCOM, had been tasked with a single objective: to infiltrate Coronado, bypass all security, and simulate the complete neutralization of its command staff. They were ghosts, experts in exploiting the very complacency that came with being the best. And they were winning. The SEALs, caught flat-footed between training rotations, reacted with furious energy. They grabbed their rifles, loaded with simunition rounds, and formed hasty defensive perimeters. But the attackers weren't playing by their rules. They didn't engage in firefights. They used the base's own infrastructure against them, appearing and disappearing in service tunnels, cutting power to key sectors, and picking off defenders one by one with single, precise shots from unexpected angles. Radio chatter, when it could be re-established on short-range frequencies, was a frantic collage of confusion. "Two down at the motor pool. I never even saw them. They've breached the west gate. How did they get past the sensors? Command is blind. All our cameras are down." Colonel Thorne stood in the CNC building, his face a mask of grim fury. On the few monitors still working, he watched his elite warriors being systematically dismantled. The Red Cell team was a scalpel, and his base was bleeding. They were less than 200 meters from his position, moving with an inhuman speed and efficiency that defied all his security protocols. His last line of defense, a fire team of 4 SEALs led by Chief Petty Officer Gallo, was setting up a final choke point in the main corridor. It felt less like a defense and more like a last stand. The pressure was immense, a physical weight in the air. This wasn't just a failed drill. It was a public humiliation delivered at the hands of their rivals. Inside the armory, Reisner heard the pops getting closer. Chief Mendez was bellowing into a dead walkie-talkie, his face flushed. The handful of armorers and support staff were huddled behind reinforced counters, their eyes wide. Reisner, however, was calm. She had been methodically reassembling a grenade launcher when the comms went down. Now, she wiped her hands on a rag, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The panic, the shouting, the uncertainty, it was all just noise. The signal was the sound of the sim rounds, the cadence of the attacker's movements, the vulnerabilities she had spent the last 4 days mapping in her mind. She walked to her assigned locker, the one containing her personal gear. She pulled out her web harness, her sidearm, and the old, battered Michigan helmet. As she strapped it on, Chief Mendez finally noticed her. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Sergeant? Get down. This isn't our fight." Reisner clipped a spare magazine to her belt and chambered a round in her pistol, the slide racking home with a satisfying snick. She turned to the chief, her gray eyes clear and focused. "Respectfully, Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "It is now." She didn't run. She flowed. Reisner moved out of the armory's side exit and into a service alleyway, a sliver of concrete and shadow ignored by the main firefight. She kept her back to the wall, her pistol held in a low-ready position, her head on a constant, methodical swivel. The world, for her, had narrowed to a series of angles, doorways, and blind corners. The chaos of the base was a symphony she could read, and she was moving between the notes. She knew the Red Cell team would be coming for the CNC building from the south, using the barracks as cover. It was the most logical route. It was also the route everyone, including the defenders, would be expecting. So she went north. She slipped through a maintenance hatch she'd noted earlier, entering the crawl space beneath the main mess hall. It was dark, tight, and smelled of dust and mildew, but it allowed her to bypass the main thoroughfares where the SEALs were being hunted. She moved with a practiced silence that was less about stealth and more about a profound economy of motion. No wasted steps, no shifting of gear, no unnecessary noise. She emerged in the shadow of the communications array, less than 50 meters from the CNC building. From here, she had a clear view of the final defensive line. CPO Gallo and his 3 men were positioned behind concrete planters, their weapons trained down the corridor. They were focused, professional, and completely exposed from their rear flank. The attackers would not hit them head-on. Reisner saw the flicker of movement first. On the roof of the adjacent administration building, 2 figures, clad in black, were setting up a rappel line. They were going to drop down behind Gallo's team, a classic vertical envelopment. While the SEALs were braced for a frontal assault, the killing blow would come from above and behind. Reisner didn't shout a warning. That would give away her position and theirs. Instead, she raised her pistol, the sights aligning with a cold, mathematical certainty. She was at the edge of the simunition's effective range, a difficult shot. She controlled her breathing, letting it out slowly, her entire world shrinking to the front sight post. 1-2. The first attacker began his descent. Reisner didn't aim for center mass. She aimed for his gear. The pop of her pistol was barely audible over the other sounds of the drill. A tiny pellet of paint smacked squarely against the man's helmet-mounted night vision goggles. A bright blue splotch obscured his vision. He was technically dead. Confused, he halted his rappel, swinging uselessly on the rope. His partner on the roof reacted instantly, spinning to locate the source of the shot. But Reisner was already moving. She had fired from the edge of shadow and had immediately melted back into it, relocating 10 feet to her left behind a large air conditioning unit. The second attacker scanned her previous position, finding nothing. He was focused hunting. He was also exposed. Reisner leaned out just enough to acquire a sight picture. Another controlled breath. Another soft pop. A blue starburst appeared on the second man's chest plate. He swore, slapping the spot in frustration, then raised a hand to signal he was out of the fight. Down below, Gallo and his team heard the muffled shots, but couldn't identify the source. They tensed, expecting an attack that never came. Reisner wasn't finished. She knew the 2 on the roof were a diversion. The main assault element would be using that distraction to make their move. She darted across an open space, using a fleet vehicle for cover, and peered around the corner towards the CNC's primary entrance. There, a third attacker, the team leader by his posture, was using a breaching tool on a locked access panel. He was 20 seconds from gaining entry to the building's server room, which would give him control of the entire network. He never heard her. She closed the distance in a silent rush, her feet barely touching the pavement. He was focused on the lock, his rifle slung. Reisner didn't use her weapon. She slammed the heel of her hand into the base of his skull, a jarring, perfectly placed strike. Her other hand snatched the rifle from his grasp as he stumbled forward, disoriented. Before he could recover, she had his own training knife out of its sheath and pressed against his throat. "You're dead," she whispered, her voice a cold, calm breeze in his ear. The Red Cell leader, a man who had not been killed in a training exercise in over a decade, slowly raised his hands. He turned his head, his eyes wide with professional shock, and looked at the Army sergeant in the ancient, scarred helmet who had just dismantled his entire assault plan in under 90 seconds. The exercise was halted by a single, terse command from the Red Cell leader into his personal radio. Exercise index. Stand down. I repeat, stand down. The sudden silence was more jarring than the chaos it replaced. On the grounds of the CNC building, operators from both sides slowly lowered their weapons, blinking in the harsh sunlight as if waking from dream. CPO Gallo and his team, who had been bracing for a final, desperate firefight, looked around in confusion. The two attackers who had been neutralized on the rooftop were now walking towards them, helmets off, shaking their heads in disbelief. Then they saw her. Reisner was standing over the Red Cell leader, his rifle still held loosely in her hand. She hadn't moved. She was a statue of quiet readiness. The man she had taken down, a legendary Master Chief from SEAL Team 6, was staring at her not with anger, but with a look of profound, analytical respect. Clear, he said to her, a single word that acknowledged her victory. He then keyed his radio again, this time to the exercise controllers. Umpire to control. My element has been neutralized. I say again, neutralized. By a single, unidentified friendly. All eyes turned to Reisner. The SEALs who had been killed across the base began to converge on the location, their faces a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Who was this woman? Where'd she come from? Specialist Davies was among them, his rifle hanging limply at his side. He had been taken out early in the fight, tagged from a window he had sworn was empty. Now he saw the sergeant from the armory holding the enemy commander captive, and the memory of her words, "You're anticipating the recoil," came rushing back. The woman didn't just see weapons, she saw everything. The laughter was gone. The condescending smirks had vanished, replaced by narrowed eyes and furrowed brows. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd of operators. Who is that? The army chick from the armory. No way. She took out Razor? By herself. I saw it. She dropped two off the roof and then ghosted him. Never made a sound. Colonel Thorne stormed out of the CNC building, his face thunderous. His initial fury at the breach was now compounded by the utter confusion of its conclusion. He saw the Red Cell leader standing with his hands up and the unassuming army sergeant who was supposedly cataloging rifles standing over him. What the hell is going on here? Thorne demanded, his voice booming across the plaza. The Red Cell leader, Razor, turned to face him. He gestured with his chin toward Reisner. Colonel, you might want to ask your sergeant. She just single-handedly shut down an attack that bypassed your entire multi-million-dollar security system and a platoon of your best men. In about 2 minutes, he paused, his gaze shifting back to Reisner and her battered helmet. Whoever she is, he added, his voice laced with grudging admiration, she's not an armorer. Colonel Thorne stared at Reisner, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet, unassuming woman from his office now stood at the epicenter of his base's most profound failure and its most baffling success. The helmet, which he hadn't even noticed before, now seemed less like a piece of junk and more like a question mark. The mockery that had surrounded her for days had evaporated under the heat of undeniable competence, leaving a vacuum of stunned, inquisitive silence in its wake. The after-action report briefing was held in a sterile, windowless conference room. The air was thick with tension. Colonel Thorne sat at the head of the table, flanked by CPO Gallo and the rest of his command staff. The Red Cell leader, Razor, sat opposite them, his expression neutral. And at the far end of the table, alone and silent, sat Sergeant Reisner. She had been ordered to attend, a subject of intense and uncomfortable scrutiny. The AAR was brutal. Razor, with cold, dispassionate precision, walked them through every security flaw his team had exploited. The predictable patrol routes, the blind spots in the camera coverage, the vulnerability of the local comms network. It was a systematic vivisection of the base's defenses. The SEALs in the room shifted uncomfortably, their pride stung. Then Razor came to the final assault. He pointed to the tactical map on the main screen. Our primary assault was a three-pronged feint designed to draw SEAL Team 3's QRF south, while my element conducted a vertical insertion here and a primary breach here. He circled the CNC building. The plan was flawless. The execution was perfect, until it wasn't. He turned his gaze down the table to Reisner. Our intel showed no significant operator presence at this location, he said, pointing to the armory. We classified the personnel as non-combatants. A fatal error. He then described, in detail, Reisner's actions, the way she had anticipated their vertical assault, the impossible shots she made to neutralize his Overwatch team, the silent, brutally efficient way she had used the base's own layout to flank and capture him. He didn't embellish. He stated the facts as a professional assessing a superior tactic. She didn't react to us, Razor concluded, his eyes locked on Thorn. She read us. She dismantled a textbook Tier 1 assault, as if she'd seen it 100 times before. Colonel, with all due respect, you don't have an armorer. You have a goddamn apex predator stocking your shelves. Colonel Thorn listened, his expression unreadable. His initial anger had been replaced by a reluctant, growing sense of intrigue. Everything he thought he knew about the woman was wrong. He cleared his throat. Sergeant Reisner, he said, his tone now devoid of its earlier condescension. The second phase of this exercise begins in 48 hours. Red Cell will be running a new series of penetration tests, this time with full knowledge of our standard defensive postures. He leaned forward. Your new assignment is to work with Chief Gallo. You will redesign our defensive strategy for the CNC sector. You will have full authority to reposition assets and rewrite protocols as you see fit. Chief Gallo's team is at your disposal. A murmur went through the room. A non-SEAL, an Army E5, was being put in charge of planning defenses for the most elite operators on the base. It was unheard of. CPO Gallo's jaw tightened. It was a direct challenge to his authority and his expertise. Sir, Gallo began, his voice tight with professional pride, my men and I are perfectly capable of... Your men were minutes away from being simulated corpses, Chief. Thorn cut in, his voice like ice. As was I. You will give the sergeant your full cooperation. That is an order. Gallo fell silent, but his skepticism was a palpable force in the room. Later that afternoon, in a small briefing room, he and his four-man team gathered around a tactical map with Reisner. The atmosphere was frosty. All right, Sergeant, Gallo said, crossing his brawny arms. We're listening. How do you plan to stop a team that can walk through walls? Reisner didn't respond to the sarcasm. She picked up a red marker and walked to the whiteboard. She didn't draw lines of defense. She drew circles. We've been thinking about defense as a static wall, she began, her voice calm and even. A perimeter to be held. That's why we lost. They are fluid, so we have to be. She began to talk about overlapping fields of fire, about mobile kill zones instead of fixed positions, about using feints and false fronts to channel the attackers into prepared engagement areas. She deconstructed their own tactics and used them to build her new strategy. For every skeptical question Gallo or his men threw at her, she had a calm, logical answer rooted in experience that was clearly vast and varied. She spoke of urban combat in ways that made their jungle and desert training seem one-dimensional. Gallo watched her, his initial resentment slowly being chipped away by her undeniable expertise. She moved and spoke with an authority that had nothing to do with rank. As she leaned over the map to point out a vulnerability, the light caught the side of her helmet, which she'd placed on the edge of the table. Gallo's eyes, trained to notice the smallest detail, narrowed. It wasn't just a scratch. It was a shape. Faded, almost invisible. He'd seen something like it before a long time ago, in a dusty briefing tent in Bagram. A symbol whispered about in reverent, fearful tones. A ghost story. Hold on, CPO Gallo said, his voice cutting through Reisner's explanation of a tertiary ambush point. He stood up and walked over to the table, his eyes fixed on the helmet. The other SEALs stopped talking, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. Reisner paused, her marker hovering over the whiteboard, and turned to look at him. Gallo reached out, his calloused fingers gently turning the helmet in the flat, fluorescent light. He leaned in close, his gaze intense. The symbol was barely there, a specter of worn-away white paint against the scarred, tense surface. It was a wolf's skull, lean and hungry, depicted with an almost skeletal ferocity. The lines were too stylized, too specific to be a random doodle. It was a crest, an unofficial, unacknowledged, but unmistakable unit marking. He felt a cold knot form in the pit of his stomach. He remembered the story now. A joint op in the mountains of Afghanistan, years ago. His team had been providing outer cordon for a group that didn't officially exist. They had no names, no ranks, just call signs. They moved like wraiths, their equipment a mix of sterile, unmarked gear and personalized, almost tribalistic talismans. One of them, their sniper, had painted that same gaunt wolf's head on his rifle stock. They called themselves nomads. Gallo looked up from the helmet, his eyes meeting Reisner's. The casual arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a dawning, incredulous awe. "Where did you get this helmet?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question freighted with a decade of battlefield rumors and classified legends. Reisner's expression didn't change, but her gray eyes seemed to deepen, to hold a history he was only now beginning to fathom. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Just then, the door to the briefing room opened. A two-star admiral, the SOCOM liaison who had flown in to oversee the exercise, stepped inside, accompanied by Colonel Thorne. The admiral, a man with the weary eyes of someone who carried the weight of the nation's darkest secrets, surveyed the scene. The SEALs standing in stunned silence, Gallo holding the helmet, and Reisner watching him. The admiral's gaze fell upon the helmet, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Thorne, oblivious to the quiet drama, cleared his throat. "Admiral, this is Sergeant Reisner. She's been assisting with our defensive reprogramming." The admiral ignored Thorne. He walked slowly toward Gallo, his eyes never leaving the helmet. He took it gently from the chief's hands, turning it over as if it were a sacred artifact. "I haven't seen one of these in a long time," the admiral said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense gravity that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He looked directly at Reisner. "The Goshawk mission, 2012. You were point for Sabre team. It wasn't a question." Reisner gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The admiral turned to the stunned faces of Thorne and the SEALs. He held up the helmet so they could all see the faded symbol. "Gentlemen, this marking is not Army issue. This is the mark of a very specific, very small group that conducted clandestine operations under JSOC. Officially, Task Force Nomad never existed." He let the weight of that statement settle in the silent room. He then looked back at Reisner, a profound respect in his eyes. "We knew her by another name." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the light fixtures. The SEALs stared at the woman they had dismissed as a clerk, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet armorer with the almost mythical reputation of the unit the admiral had just named. The admiral's next words landed like a controlled demolition, shattering every last remnant of their prejudice. Her call sign was Wraith. The name hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken meaning. Wraith. It wasn't just a call sign, it was a legend. A ghost story told in hushed tones by operators in smoke-filled tents from the Hindu Kush to the Horn of Africa. The sniper who could make impossible shots in zero visibility conditions. The tracker who could follow an enemy across solid rock. The operator who slipped through enemy lines like smoke, leaving only silence and confusion in her wake. A name associated with the most dangerous, most sensitive, and most successful missions of the last decade. And she was standing right here in their briefing room, wearing an E5's uniform. The SEALs looked at each other, their faces a canvas of shock and dawning comprehension. The old helmet, the mismatched uniform, the redacted file, it all snapped into focus. It wasn't a sign of incompetence. It was the camouflage of a professional who had operated so far outside the conventional military that its rules and appearances no longer applied to her. She was a ghost hiding in plain sight. Specialist Davies, standing in the back, felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He remembered his joke about the surplus store helmet and the casual disrespect he and his friends had shown her. They had been laughing at a living legend, judging a master of their craft by the cover of a book they weren't even cleared to read. CPO Gallo slowly took the helmet back from the admiral and placed it reverently on the table. He turned to face Reisner, his expression stripped of all its earlier pride and skepticism. He didn't offer a clumsy apology. An apology would have been an insult, a trivialization of the profound misjudgment he had made. Instead, he did what professionals do. He acknowledged his superior. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture becoming as rigid and formal as hers, and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent, unambiguous gesture of complete and total respect. One warrior to another. Colonel Thorne was speechless. The administrative headache he had tried to bury in his armory was, in fact, one of the most elite soldiers in the United States military. He had ordered a woman known as Wraith to manage inventory. The sheer scale of his error was humbling. He walked forward, stopping directly in front of Reisner, his earlier authority replaced by a newfound deference. He extended his hand. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and earnest. "My mistake. It was a simple admission, but coming from a man like Thorne, it was more meaningful than 1,000 words of praise." Reisner looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, her eyes as unreadable as ever. "No mistake, Colonel," she replied, her voice even. "I'm here to follow orders." She had won, not by boasting, not by revealing her past, but by simply being who she was. Her actions had spoken with a clarity that no commendation or file ever could. The laughter was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet, profound awe. The base and the men on it had been irrevocably changed. They had been reminded that the most dangerous weapon is often the one you underestimate the most. The next day, the base operated with a new and unspoken understanding. When Sergeant Reisner walked from her barracks to the armory, the path seemed to clear for her. The casual greetings from the SEALs were different now. The tone was laced with deference. The smirks were gone, replaced by nods of acknowledgement, some hesitant, others crisp with military respect. She acknowledged them all with the same quiet economy she applied to everything else, a slight inclination of her head, before continuing on her way. She asked for no special treatment, and her demeanor had not changed one bit. The revelation of her past had altered their perception of her, but it had not altered her perception of herself. She spent the morning back in the armory, not because she was ordered to, but because it was her assigned place of duty. Chief Mendez, who had been informed of the situation, now treated her less like a subordinate and more like a visiting dignitary, offering her coffee and asking if there was anything she needed. She politely declined, picked up a tablet, and went back to her work in Section Gamma. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. She was still just a sergeant, quietly scanning barcodes on rifle stocks. But everything had changed. Specialist Davies approached the armory counter, his posture uncertain. He needed to draw a new optic for the upcoming drill. He waited for her to look up, and when she did, he found he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Sergeant," he started, his voice quiet. "Mom, about the other day, my comments, they were out of line. I'm sorry." Reisner finished scanning a pistol case and looked at him. There was no judgment in her eyes, no satisfaction. There was only a calm, professional stillness. "Worry about your trigger squeeze, specialist," she said, her voice flat. "That's what will keep you alive, not my opinion of you." She turned, retrieved the requested optic from a shelf, and placed it on the counter. The interaction was over. It was a dismissal, but it was also absolution. She didn't care about his apology. She cared about his performance. It was the most profound lesson he could have learned. Later that evening, long after the sun had dipped below the Pacific horizon, Reisner was alone on the far end of the shooting range. She hadn't been ordered there. She had simply come. The air was cool and smelled of the sea. Under the harsh white lights, she stood at the firing line, her pistol in hand, methodically placing rounds in a tight, single-hole group on a target 50 meters away. On the bench behind her sat the old, battered helmet. Its scars and scrapes seemed to absorb the light, a testament to a life lived on the ragged edge of conflict. The faded wolf's skull, the symbol of the Wraith, was turned towards the ocean, its hollow eyes staring out into the darkness. It was not a trophy. It was not a memento. It was a piece of her, a silent partner that had shared her burdens and kept her secrets. It was a quiet reminder that respect is not given by rank or reputation. It is forged in silence, earned through action, and carried with a dignity that needs no announcement. The helmet, and the woman who wore it, were proof.